welcome to our town hall on the contextual integrity of contact tracing. I'm Blaise Ur. I'm an assistant professor. And welcome to our town hall on the contextual integrity of contact tracing. I'm Blaise Ur. I was getting lots of feedback there. Great. So I'm Blaise Ur. I am an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Chicago, and I'm one of the 4 co-organizers of today's town hall. So originally, today we all would have been gathering in Chicago last year. After a great symposium on contextual integrity at Berkeley, we decided that we would hold it in Chicago this year. But of course, the pandemic changed those plans quite a bit, and also gave us a new topic for part of today's town hall. And so we want to be clear that this isn't the next symposium on applications of contextual integrity, but it's rather in some ways a placeholder to keep up the momentum of this community before we can reconvene again in person, right? So these past couple of symposia on applications of contextual integrity have led to some great discussions, a number of collaborations. In fact, a former postdoc of mine went to the first one, came back, we started working on a project with people he had met there, and then we sent a paper to the second. So I think that's exactly what we want to happen in basically today's event, is to keep building bridges among different parts of the community, right? So the way we've set up the day is the first hour of the session will be a panel on COVID-19 contact tracing and looking at those through the lens of privacy as contextual integrity. And I'll let Marshni in a little bit introduce that panel. Following that, we'll have a short 30-minute break, followed by group discussions. We have 3 different groups on law and CI, research and CI, and design and CI, led by a pair of great moderators each. And so these will be interactive group discussions with about 20-something people each, assuming everyone comes. It'll be an opportunity for you to get to know each other and know what you're all thinking. Right, and so we were actually really excited to have about 80 people sign up for today's event. So I see right now we have 42 participants in the Zoom room already. Right, for those of you who haven't joined yet, we have a bit.ly link right up here for our Slack channel, and we highly encourage you to join, introduce yourselves, and have a way that's much less clunky than Zoom to interact with your fellow participants. Right, and I guess before we go over to the panel, I'd like to have my 3 fellow co-organizers introduce themselves. Marshni, Jan, and Helen, in that order.
Hi everyone, thanks for attending today. We're really excited that you're here. My name is Marshni Chetty. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Computer Science. And I'll turn it over to Jan.
Hi everyone, really great to see you all, and we're really looking forward for this town hall. My name is Jan Schwarzenegger. I'm a faculty fellow at NYU and a visiting researcher at DLI at Cornell Tech. And welcome. And Helen.
Yeah, hi. I also want to add my welcome to everybody and say how really, it's been a roller coaster of disappointment when we finally decided that we weren't going to have this in person, and just like a huge upswing and so nourishing when we figured that we would do this. And I know the organizers worked really hard, surprisingly hard, even though we weren't doing things like catering and accommodation, but it's still difficult, even though it's going to look easy. Thanks.
Great. So again, to add, welcome to everyone. And I'm going to turn it over now to Marshni, who will introduce the panelists and kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Blaise. So yeah, we thought for this virtual town hall that to, get us all on the same page, we talk about something that's very relevant right now, and that is the topic of contact tracing. And so we've invited these 3 panelists who are working in this area to speak to us about that. I'll be giving them prompting questions to kind of kick off the discussion, and we'll probably have, say, about 30 minutes of discussion with these prepared questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the general audience. And at that time, you can either raise your virtual hand or try to wave us down, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. So to start, first, I thought we'd give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So we've asked them each to prepare a little introduction, and then we'll start kicking off the discussion. So I'll turn it back to Helen to see if she wants to add anything to her introduction. So Helen, who are you and why are you on this panel?
I am a professor at Cornell Tech and director of the Digital Life Initiative. Michael Byrne made me this lovely background. Sorry if it's like making you crazy. Excuse me. I've been really going down the rabbit hole with so-called contact tracing apps, exposure notification, because it just was, the world was presenting us an incredible example as an instrument for understanding privacy theories. And I hope we'll have that discussion. And yeah, we will have that discussion.
Yes, we will shortly have that discussion. Thanks, Helen. So let's turn it over to Seda. So Seda, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Seda Gurses. I'm an associate professor at the Technical University in Delft. That's in the Netherlands, in a faculty of technology, policy, and management. So lots of words. I came to contact tracing partially because my long-time collaborator and co-author, that special relationship, Carmela Troncoso, was pulled into a project that we then named DP3T, that was Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. And she called me one day and said, we are in trouble, come in. We can finally implement some of our privacy engineering stuff. We can even put contextual integrity as our guiding principle, but there's trouble, come in. And that's how I got into it. And I think it's been quite an interesting ride in Europe. I think there's some differences in how things happen in different parts of the globe. So I hope we can touch that too. But I think what I thought was a privacy engineering project actually turned into something that was very indicative of the political economy of current day computational infrastructures. I was surprised to find my research in this project. So we'll talk about it more in a moment.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction. Okay, so Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Michael Zimmer, and I'm an associate professor in computer science at Marquette University in beautiful Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I started thinking about contextual integrity when I was lucky enough to be Helen's student, and have been applying it across numerous contexts over the years, and most recently working closely with Dr. Jessica Vitak at University of Maryland and some of her team. We've been looking at contextual integrity as it applies to things like fitness trackers and employee monitoring, and all of a sudden, all that work kind of coalesced with contact tracing and what's happening given the pandemic. And so we're seeing some really interesting ways that these overlap some of our other research interests. So I look forward to talking about that.
Great. Thank you so much for those introductions. So now let's kick off the discussion. So I thought the first opening question for the panelists would be, just because we want everyone to be on the same page, is what is contact tracing? And specifically, how do we distinguish, we've heard this buzzword a lot, especially in the context of COVID-19. So how do we think about contact tracing as a general practice in healthcare and population health? And how do we distinguish that from, what's been offered by big companies like Apple and Google? So I'll put that question out there, and, you can decide who's going to speak first. You can also wave, and who wants to tackle give us the intro? Okay, Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I have to beg a little bit of forbearance from people who really know about contact tracing, and they would be found in public health and population health officers and epidemiologists. But from what I learned from them and from reading, I mean, I think there's now this conflation of contact tracing with the contact tracing apps, which is really a huge problem. And so I want to put on the table that this thing that we call contact tracing, and I had done this kind of nerdy research, could be traced back to the 1850s, maybe even earlier, where this guy John Snow in London was following cholera outbreaks and trying to figure out the source of these outbreaks by understanding who was in contact with who. So it was really this effort. And from that, I just tried to set in place what are the aims of contact tracing, if that's what we're doing. And it was important for me to lay this out and say the various aims of contact tracing or goals, like what function does it serve? One could be just individual health. So with some diseases like sexually transmitted diseases, you may want to alert the individual that someone they've been in contact with has an STD. Another one is, scientific and clinical learning, which is, how does this disease spread? And if you do the contact tracing, you can see it. I mean, it can inform your understanding. So, by the way, deep inside these apps is a theory that it's, 6 feet and 15 minutes. How do they find that? That's through empirical research and so on. And then just one final, and I see that Seda wants to raise her hands, but a final purpose is the population health and the epidemiological models of transmission. And that's a third really important thing that we can get from contact tracing. That's even before you talk about the technology.
Great. Thanks, Helen. So Seda, you wanted to add in?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the guiding sources that we looked at was the World Health Organization. And apparently, I did some interviews with epidemiologists as well, and they were saying that they look at the definition for a given epidemic, what the contact definition is, and then based on that, you do contact tracing, and that's determined by the World Health Organization, which I assume is determined by a bunch of researchers. And so the 15 minutes and the distance that was given was from the World Health Organization, whatever it is that their workflows that produce that result. So I just wanted to add that to Helen's thing. Yeah.
Great. And Michael, did you have anything to add?
I mean, one of the things I find really interesting is just the language that we're using when we talk about these kinds of technologies, and whether we call it an app or a platform, and all the things that come along with that kind of discursive framing around these tools. The idea that I really like how Google and Apple call this, exposure notification. It's very passive, it's very soft and kind, and it makes us think about these tools in a very specific way in terms of, and that they're not tracing, and certainly we don't want to use the word tracking in any of this dialogue, because that would open up a whole nother set of concerns among the population. And even just listening, to Seda and Helen's description, we have a whole lot of trust that someone's, that these assumptions are correct, that it is 6 feet and it is 15 minutes. And of course, we all trust that, but we're also in this environment where we're increasingly skeptical, and a certain part of the population is more skeptical than others. So it's creating all these other interesting challenges that we're starting to see as we try to convince people to use these kinds of tools. I think, Seda, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, you reminded me of something that I wanted to mention was the interviews I made showed that contact tracing was a very human practice, as much as it was informed by these amazing technocratic international organizations. People who worked, for example, for Ebola, in the case of Ebola, they would, work with villagers, and it's a very, very social practice. And in fact, what happens with apps, and I think that's really nice that you reminded me of that, Michael, is that we turn something that is a medical social practice into an engineering problem that runs on global computational infrastructures, in this case on Google and Apple, with the method of engineering being optimization, right? And there's a whole set of consequences that come with that, including the fact that most contact tracing is attached to a call center, which are already optimized workplaces. And a lot of the work at DP3T was trying to optimize the measurements between people. So I think that shift is really, really important to keep in mind when we talk about the apps versus the practice itself.
Right. So that's really nice that you've all defined contact tracing as basically sort of letting someone know, giving them some sort of notification that they've been in contact with someone who either has had some sort of healthcare issue, right, that may affect them. And so, Seda, you brought this up nicely, and so did you, Michael. And Helen, is clearly this affects privacy for various reasons because of the infrastructure and so on. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, why is this of concern? You've mentioned apps, and you've mentioned also these sort of soft language that people are using so as not to get us thinking about tracking and so on. Can you tell us more about how we should be thinking about this in terms of privacy? And again, feel free to raise hand if you want to take the first gander.
Well, I'll jump in. I think one important consideration is that in order for this kind of I guess intervention to work, we need adoption, and we need widespread adoption if this is going to work at all. And so we need to address these concerns. We need to overcome, from a public health perspective, make people comfortable, make people want to employ these kinds of tools in order to help automate. And I guess I like the way you framed that, turning this into an engineering problem. So how do we get the most widespread adoption and the most efficient way to process and notify people? So that's of course why, even thinking about how we deploy something on our campus, we were careful to make sure that it was not an app that we're using, that we use the language of a platform, that we are not installing things on people's phones that could have some secondary, technological tracking or some other kind of concern being raised. So I think that's why, at the front end, privacy is such a key part of doing this, because we are engaging in health related monitoring of people in one way or another, and so that's going to be that primary fear.
I mean, I could jump in and because the question, Marshani, is I think the question you ask, it could be interpreted in some different ways, and one of the ways is a little bit the framing, which is how have people been framing the privacy concerns of contact tracing, and this then, because when you would say to us, like, what are the privacy implications? I know what they are to me, thinking through the lens of contextual integrity. But when you just randomly look at what people are saying in the media or in conversations, and just like innumerable podcasts and so forth, they say things like, well, first of all, as Michael suggests, this is quite a personal, you consider this health-related information to be something that there are only a few people who you would like to access the health information. Then there's a lot of concern that this information is going to fall into the wrong hands, and you have somehow this gets translated into people have a right to control, all sorts of concerns about who you can trust with this information. So this runs the gamut of what at least I'm hearing about what the privacy concerns are. So it's like, this is what the privacy concerns are that I'm seeing expressed. I don't think those are all the basic, most important privacy concerns. Obviously, we're going to get to that, but yeah.
All right, Seda, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there were like very different layers of privacy concerns, and I would say contextual integrity was one of them. So I think I'll start with the contextual integrity one, and I would say that as a practice, contact tracing always has to be very savvy with privacy, even with the one that would happen, with villagers walking 5 kilometers and, knocking on somebody's door. And that was anywhere from participation, but also potential naming and shaming in these villages, right? Or being able to, being excluded or socially stigmatized, et cetera. So there are that kind of interpersonal issues that would affect the participation in contact tracing, which we found was really important. And I think that's kind of what Michael is referring to as well. Then there's the question about when you turn it into a platform that is going to be co-run or apps that are going to be co-run on computational infrastructures vis-a-vis governments and Google and Apple, then we have almost two sets of questions. One is the potential abuse of that data by different agencies in the government, so the classical constitutional definition of privacy. But then we also had the computational infrastructure concern, which is that a lot of these companies we see are very interested in profiling themselves as platforms through which governments can manage their populations. So they're actually positioning themselves in a way between citizens and governments. And one of the ways that they position themselves as arbitrating the privacy needs of individuals vis-a-vis their governments. So it's a power game, right? It's an infrastructure that is inserting itself between citizens and governments using privacy. So we had these very different layers that were playing out as we went from designing a little app to Google and Apple showing up and saying, we preserve privacy.
Right, that's great. I really like that. And actually, so I think there's a lot to unpack there. But I think before we start unpacking further, I think we still needed to know a little bit more. So you've mentioned in your comments, like different schemes or different ways that people are approaching this. And Seda, you've mentioned DP3T, which I'd love you to explain to everyone so that we have a better idea of what that is. And then maybe Michael and Helen could also tell us about some of these other schemes used by Google and Apple. How do these actually differ? Because it sounds like some of these concerns that you've laid out and these questions are going to differ depending on who's doing the data collection, who has access to it, and what is it being used for? Is it surveillance, like you mentioned, or is it health monitoring, or et cetera? So could you tell us more about the different kinds of ways that people are implementing this?
I'll take a shot, and I'll try not to be too lengthy because there are many things that happened and many approaches that have been taken. I think the original, many of the first apps that were developed in Eastern Asia and some of the earlier apps developed in different countries in Europe and even in the US were relying on location data. And it became very clear very quickly that location data was, on the one hand, overkill, like you would be basically repurposing location data for health purpose, which seemed like a very bad idea anyways. But also that maybe, and it didn't work. It was not working in the engineering sense, right? Not working in the sense as it didn't work in buildings and it was not accurate enough. Now, Bluetooth was never made for proximity tracing, and there were two options for engineers. They could either use the microphone and use sound frequencies to measure distance, but that would require apps getting access to your microphone, which is also a privacy consideration. And Bluetooth was seen as kind of the good alternative, even though, as I said, it was never meant for proximity measurements. And the issue with proximity and Bluetooth was that Apple, for privacy reasons, had closed off the low energy Bluetooth API to apps so that they wouldn't use it for, tracking people. So they had to literally undo that API to allow apps to be able to run in the background without consuming people's phone. Again, this is an adoption issue. You see how quickly contact tracing becomes continuously about adoption, markets, and optimization. Now, even when that problem was solved, independent of that, there were two kind of dominant proposals coming out of the privacy engineering communities or security engineers looking at this. And these were dubbed as the centralized versus the decentralized solution. I will not go into the details except the fact that the centralized solution would, once somebody is identified as being infected, would upload all of your social contacts to a central entity, which would then decide who to inform, which meant that you were kind of more pseudonymous than anonymous vis-a-vis the centralized entity, and it was supposed to be the trusted health authority. And there was also interest in using this data to do a sort of social network analysis and epidemiological analysis. The decentralized model said, no, we don't want any government health authority to get this kind of social network data, which literally, as more and more people get infected, is everybody's social network data to some extent. I'll come back to that caveat. And instead, what they did is you would announce the kind of beacons that you have used with your Bluetooth, and everybody would check on their phone if they encountered an infected person or not. So they wouldn't know who was infected, but they would know that they had encountered somebody and therefore should get tested. This became a battleground. Eventually, Germany went for the decentralized model. And as geeky as it is, Angela Merkel gave a press conference and said, we would like decentralized. It's better for privacy. I don't know what people made out of that, but it's great. And the French said, no, centralized. And the arbiter of that, and that's what I was referring to earlier, was Google and Apple, and who said the health authorities should not get this data. We err on the side of privacy because we like our users or whatever, and basically said, if you're going to use our Bluetooth API, you have to opt for the decentralized model. Did I do an okay job in... just to let you know that the DP3T was practically adopted by Google and Apple. So what the underlying design is very much, they said, inspired by DP3T, whatever that means.
Right. Wow. No, that's an excellent overview of like the different models. Helen and Michael, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, I wanted to say something and then also push on this question of whether the Google Apple API actually captures the spirit of a decentralized. Yeah. You're saying this is what they say. So maybe I'll just dive right in, because I know we want to have some discussion, and I think that what was interesting to me as I watched all the dominoes falling and people adopting the Google Apple API was that, like, embedded in this API is this idea that privacy is control over information about yourself. And it sets up the certain conditions. So, you have the app, which is presumably created by the population and just, public health authority. I've been talking with the New York State folks, and by the way, this is costing them a lot of money, so money that's probably coming away from the human contact tracers. And first of all, the subjects choose whether to install, the data subjects choose. So this is what control amounts to. If it works according to this plan, then they choose whether to reveal to the system if they get a positive test finding, to insert this into the system. And then when you're exposed, let's say you get the exposure notification, you can then choose whether to take whatever the token is and contact your public health authority. So it means that some of the purposes of contact tracing are served, but because somehow or other we're placing our trust more in Google and Apple, even though it's a black box once it gets into the system, no matter what they say, nobody can go and actually audit what's going on there. We're withholding potentially valuable information from the folks who are going to do the scientific analysis, who are going to then feed this back to the WHO, who are responsible. So that's being withheld from them. And for better or for worse, individuals aren't told exactly like when and who they got it from. And I mean, that's a debate, a discussion to be had. Nobody's mandated to get the app, blah, blah, blah. So it's in terms of this privacy as control doesn't respond to what it is that contact tracing historically was doing in the first place. And so you have to ask the question of, this gets us to that like trade-off that privacy as control always gets us to. And I think that contextual integrity can do a better job than that.
That's great. And Helen, that brings us to our next question, which, Michael, if you want to add to what Helen was saying, is how can contextual integrity actually help us to answer these questions? And how can they help us deal with some of these issues of privacy? Because it seems like there's a lot in there. Michael, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I can try to start us out. I mean, this has been a great discussion and a great build up to this question. And really what we're seeing here is a classic example of what we often teach our students about these privacy trade-offs. And, am I willing to give up a little bit of privacy to get personalized search results or whatever it might be? And here we actually have a health crisis, and one of these really good classic ethical debates about, my personal autonomy versus, public welfare. And like Seda was saying, once we shift this discussion and once we come up with a technological solution, it changes the whole way we think about this idea. It's just what Helen was describing, where all of a sudden we move into a control model, and we assume the problem solved. And it's something that Jessica and I wrote about, where all of a sudden, once we put this platform in place, what is that slippery slope that we are getting comfortable with in terms of this interface between these companies and governments and my health data and all these problems. So that's what I think that's why we're all here, because contextual integrity allows us to sort of unpack some of these layers and some of these issues. And I think what I found really helpful in using contextual integrity to think about this is being able to also just look beyond that initial trade-off, that initial question about, my health data isn't going to a third party, it isn't going to a centralized database. We are preserving, the informational norms within that space. Thank you, Apple. Thank you, Google. Let's go ahead. We take it one step further and we realize there are these larger, broader moral political values at risk, in my opinion, when we start saying, that this is an acceptable way to frame this problem. We're moving, this has been just really helped clarify my thinking just this morning, moving this social human process into a technological solution, and then just wiping our hands because, we figured out how to do Bluetooth in a way that no one else is going to find out. And it's too easy, and it's almost like that first level analysis gets us too comfortable too quickly, which is where, again, thank you, Helen, for the third part of the book, where we really just need to dig deeper into our assessments. And that's kind of where I'm coming from, but I'm sure Helen and Seda can express it better.
Right. Thanks, Michael. That was excellent. So Seda, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. So I'm gonna push back a little, because Carmel and I were thinking about contextual integrity all the time when we built DP3T, right? And here's what I'm going to say. I think that when we were designing DP3T, we were thinking of national apps that are driven by, on the one hand, contextual standard informational norms as determined by WHO with respect to contact tracing, and the norms that were given to us by the local health authorities. It is when Google and Apple turned this into a global solution that we lost a lot of our contextual analysis. It's weird. It's the same design, but once it went global, something goes berserk. So it's a question to all of us, actually. Can we have contextual integrity at the level of infrastructure? And we discussed this a lot with Helen when I was in New York. And I think the question persists, and I think this is a good example to unpack it in. Let me just say what I mean with we had contextual integrity in our mind at all times. We took the WHO standards, we worked with epidemiologists, and we said, what does the contact tracer need to know? And we really just implemented that. And everything else that would be benefiting from a computational infrastructure made for surveillance, we found a way to chuck out, right? And that was kind of the mechanisms we used. And then we looked at norms of oversight. Now, these are not informational norms that were given out by health authorities or government agencies. So they wanted to have some sort of transparency on how the application works and make sure that it does what it says it does. And also they wanted to have a sunsetting clause. So in their own context, they wanted to say, we don't want this app anymore, and to stop. The moment it became a global app like Google or embedded into the operating system like Apple, the sunsetting clause becomes very difficult until the last user turns it off or they take it off of the operating system. And then we also looked at scientific norms. And it was very clear that Bluetooth was not made for proximity tracing. The data is extremely noisy. So to do any sort of epidemiological study on this, based on the limited data we had because of the measurements we made in lockdowns, would have been actually using non-scientific data for scientific purposes. So we actually had a donation mechanism for people to give it, to upload their proximity, people in their proximity. We took it out because it would have been crunching numbers and saying something, but it would be absolutely irresponsible. So this is how we took in the norms and embedded in them. And I think what broke us was the way it became global infrastructure. And I don't know exactly what happens there, but that's my challenge to us as a question. Is that true or not?
That's great. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
No, but I saw Helen raise her hand.
Oh, right. Helen, I missed that.
I don't think that that's really a pushback. I mean, I think that there's always recognition that within different cultures or countries, groups of people, you're going to have different organizations, different parties are doing different things and under different constraints. So it's quite possible that France thought it was okay to have it centralized because the government can be trusted. I mean, that they're always looking out for the welfare and health of their population. And they are run by very strict democratic standards, blah, blah, blah. So I did want to put in and how you do that in the infrastructure, given all these problems that you're talking about, you're basing it on Bluetooth, it's kind of tragic because we're not prepared to look at these flows in the way that says public health authorities pledge, as part of who they are, to use the data in this way and not, confidentiality and so on. We can provide a much more effective approach to doing the contact tracing. But as you say, we want to do things at scale and therefore we want it to work no matter what the cultural norms are of the society. And so we're going to go for something that can be done, Bluetooth maybe, ineffectively, and we're going to place all these constraints and make as if, we're respecting privacy, but don't tell anyone by doing that you're actually, denigrating the efficacy of the product, rather than to say, here are just as Michael was saying, that there are these different roles that people adopt and you have the norms of the context to rely on, and they're different across different cultures. So no, I think that those were just the right challenges. But
Great.
Yeah, sorry.
Great, that's awesome. And I think that's a good point, actually, at which we will open it up now for questions. So hopefully that's set the groundwork for what we're talking about. And if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. Physical hand, it might be a little harder for me to see that, but if you want to raise your virtual hand, that might be easier. To raise your virtual hand, you have to go to participants, and I think you can say raise hand, I believe, and I can certainly unmute you to ask a question. Okay, so...
And there's some comments also.
Yes. So I'm looking for raised hands. I thought someone did raise their hand and then, Frank. I will.
That's right.
Yes, I will. Yes, you can unmute yourself, I think, or can I unmute?
If you hear me, then I was able
go
to
ahead.
unmute myself. Okay, perfect. Seda and everybody on the panel, thank you so much for your thoughts there. I really enjoyed the discussion. One follow-up, Seda, I was wondering, when you said you sort of lost, you see the challenge in when it became global and, a global infrastructure. Do you see, which part of the globalness? I mean, would the decentralized work, a global system but still implemented decentralized have worked? Or is it just that, when the underlying infrastructure is global and so many potential people or institutions or governments could have their hands on, where's that switch, or where's the threshold where you think this becomes problematic? I wasn't quite sure, is global bigger than Europe? Is global bigger than a single country? What's your thought on that?
I think these are just intuitions, right? Or these are observations that I don't know to say these are exactly principles that made the break, but I can just tell you the observations, which is that so when Apple and Google decided to pull the contact tracing functionality into the operating system or into an app that they packaged, they basically decided to push it on all the phones that they have control over. And I don't know the exact number. Some say 99%, but I don't think it's that high. So that removed the possibility. countries can still have national apps, but we're already seeing some technical interferences of the operating system changes to these APIs, and things are breaking sometimes and not. And so this already shows you that all the contact tracing national apps are now dependent on the continuation of those APIs. And as soon as they're turned off, their populations are dependent on the Google and Apple functionality that is there. Now, whether people will use it or not, those are all very different questions, but they have already tipped the balance in different ways as to whether a nation state, and I'm not promoting nation states, right? But those are the units we're working with. A nation state introduces an app. In the case of the US, it's the states, right? And now like California and Washington have already said we're going to use the Google and Apple solution instead of making our own for hundreds of reasons, right? Like they don't have the money, the capacity to do this and whatever. And so it tips, so the infrastructure starts deciding not only whether there will be an app, whether it will use the Bluetooth API, but the fact that a population will have access to this functionality, right? And that completely changes what kind of oversight mechanisms you can introduce. So it breaks democratic governance processes that you have and replaces them with infrastructural decisions. So that's
okay. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the second one is maybe there's a political economic one. You know, a lot of services scale, as Helen mentioned, because they serve the same thing to everyone. And it's hopefully like a good middle ground that everybody's kind of sufficiently happy with. And that's where the optimization comes in. But we already know different countries are unhappy. I mean, France to begin with, but, you know, also colleagues in Israel sent me some notes. They're unhappy with the Google and Apple solution. And so basically when you scale, you kind of create a mono space, right? And it will be costly for any company to make contextual changes. So what you try to do is you try to merge everyone into a solution that will scale. So that is another place where it breaks, because what they say is that our privacy by design standard, which is a decentralized one that's now implemented, is the global standard for privacy, right? And it becomes very difficult for people to say, well, you know, our communities need different kinds of information to feel like their privacy is respected. That is too costly and would not scale. So it will not win against this global model. And the last one is when you took it to this global model that Google and Apple have, they now, I think, they're saying that there will be some sort of transparency of the generated Android app, but we don't really know what they do in their operating system. That's usually a trade secret. But also, the only scientific thing that one could really do was to measure Bluetooth and try to become more precise and hopefully find something else that could replace Bluetooth. That scientific work can no longer be done unless they expose more and more of the data to researchers. And, you know, they might come up and say, we selected 5 researchers from this important university in the US, probably, you know, to do these measurements, which will not only close off science to certain institutions. So again, the global infrastructure provider decides who does science, what kind of science is done, and usually it's not going to be international. So the global here is also which countries can afford to have smartphones with Bluetooth that then is sufficient for doing this kind of thing, right? Like, so all of those things. And the final note, the whole idea of population management with technology, that is a global proposition. And I don't know if we should subscribe to it. There's a question mark there.
Great. Thank you so much, Seda. Frauke, did you want to just tell us who you are and your affiliation just before we move on to the next question?
My apologies. I got so excited that I jumped right in. My name is Frauke Kreuter. If you think an A at the end, then it's easier to pronounce my name. I'm with the University of Maryland in the US and also here in Germany with the University of Mannheim. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Frauke. Okay, so let's move to Julie Holly. We're going to try to get through all our questions before we close. So Julie Holly, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And also introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Julie Holly. I just want to, before I ask my question, I want to frame it and say that I have been following the whole contact tracing thing in Canada, in New York City especially. I live in New York State. I've also been fascinated by the Chinese version of all of this as well. Seda, when you were talking about the tradition in a village, when you knock on people's doors and sort of that's the approach. one of the things that was in my mind immediately is a conflict that I had personally with a physician friend of mine who is a family doctor in Minnesota. We were talking, this is in February, so social distancing rules were starting to, everybody was trying to figure out how to deal with social distancing. And I said, you know, Renee, as a family physician in Minnesota, you're good. But as a New Yorker, we're in a lot of trouble. So now to Dr. Nissenbaum's wonderful remarks, and I'm so glad she's here, but I'm her #1 fan in the world. I want to get this issue of flow as a matter of the difference between a village and a city, the difference between a rural community in the United States. For 30 years, we've been having a debate about connection issues, and now we have the smartphones that are at the central, Google, Apple, they don't care. As long as you buy their device. That's why a global model doesn't work for those of us who actually want to have solutions in a contextual integrity manner. Wait, I don't think I have a question, actually. Sorry about that, but that's it.
Thanks, Judy. That was a good comment, though, and very interesting how, thinking about the differences between rural versus city and so on, a lot in there, because we've just been talking about it as though they're all the same thing, which I think Seda was trying to get at. Okay, so let's move on to the question by Sunny Manduva, and if you want to introduce yourself, your name and affiliation.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. I'm Sunny. I'm a grad student at RIT, and I'm into usable security as well. I work as a research assistant at the Center for Accessibility and Inclusion Research. It was an amazing event. So before I got started, I thought CI was something like a contextual inquiry, but apparently it's not. And now I'm into it more than ever. And, I found this beautiful article by, Michael Zimmer while I was going through it. So, coming to context and just adding to what Seda was telling, if you take India, the contact tracing application Arogya Setu was launched back in March, and there are more than 120 million users by July. And the government has actually imposed all the, government and non-government employees to download it, without a choice. So, and there is no idea what the government is going to do with the data that they collect or whatever. I think privacy is more of a societal issue. So if you come from an India where, or even now, I don't want to buy any product, even for privacy, I'll be okay with being a product. Or if you come from Europe, I think privacy is one of the most. So I love GDPR, by the way. How do you inculcate or how do you educate people about this privacy? So as you said, Apple and Google care about their sales or their products at the end of the day. But it's us people that need to care about our privacy or, what is happening with our devices or technology at the end of the day. How can people get more educated, when you come from a place where you are okay to be the product, when it's free.
Great question. So who wants to take that? Helen, Michael?
I could jump in.
Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Sonny. That's a great provocation, and I think many of us, I'm sure, here deal with this struggle of literacy when we're researching subjects or whatever kind of communities that we're engaging with on how do people know what's happening with their data. Even if you wanted to embrace a control model of privacy, you still would need to have a base understanding of where your information is flowing, what kind of information into whom. And I think this is exactly the point that Seda and even Julie and others are making, that if we're going to deploy a platform like this, how do we have that level of trust or understanding of what's happening? What happens when we turn it from a local social action into a platform and into a global platform, like with Seda's point. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer on how do we make sure that people in global communities, in even marginalized communities, if we don't get them to trust how this kind of a technology is going to work, we're not going to be able to achieve what we're hoping for with that. I think this other question of trust brings up also Helen, mentioned the importance of comparing the trust we might have in a health authority to collect or have this data versus someone else. And we've been doing some research where we look at, do people care whether or not the app came from their local health office or from the federal government or from, a technology provider, and how does that play into people's comfort levels of what they're willing to do? One of the challenges I'm seeing is even at a campus level, my health authority is also my employer and is also where people work, is also where people live, so we have all these contexts that are just, collapsing into one thing, which is increasingly happening because we're now working from home or we're living at work or however you want to frame it. So, these challenges are just getting harder, I think, as we start grappling with this.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. So I think we definitely have a few questions that we can answer here. So I'm going to go to Sophia Bayek. And if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us your affiliation, that would be great.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sophia Engberg. I go by Sophia. I'm a PhD candidate in communication at the University of Southern California, and I'm so great that I can hear all these insights from you all. And I have two quick questions. I'd like to hear your thoughts if you have any. First is kind of revisiting the scale question. I think the things get complicated not only because the infrastructure is trying to be implemented at a global scale, but the actual movement of people can be global, not necessarily limited to local regions. I mean, there are some differences, obviously, in the current pandemic situation because there are a lot of restrictions on travelings and etc. But I was wondering if you have encountered any challenges or if you have thought about these problems of coming up with a technical solution with contextual integrity in mind, complicated with the problem of global movement of actual bodies. And my second question is kind of going off of this. Google and Apple recently announced their new tool called Exposure Notification Express to raise the adoption rate of state health agencies, especially in the United States, because there have been only 6 to 7 states up until now who decided to adopt this Apple Google system, which is pretty slow start or slow adoption compared to what it was expected as they rolled out their new system. So I was wondering if you have also any thoughts on what are the possible implications of this new tool, the Express being really efficient model, and what are the ramifications of those power dynamics between corporate infrastructures and government, as now they are even trying to make this system more adoptable, sort of, considering all these possible reasons for costly creation of apps and etc.
Great. Helen, you've got to unmute yourself.
All right. I sort of want to emphasize what you just said. Neva Elkin-Corin has been very passionate about this point, and I want to echo it, which is that, first of all, Google, Apple infrastructure, the API, determines some of the flows of information for whatever reasons. And in so doing, and I think I echo what Seda says here, they have taken the mantle of setting social policy that should be settled through legitimate political means. So that's number one. Second, if you take on board this control idea, then you're back to this point where how do you know, like let's say your state does have an app and so forth, how do you know what the flows are going to be? Well, answer, go read the privacy policy. Oops, we know where that goes. Finally, your point about the globalization is, and again, echoing these points that we don't really know what's going on in the operating system, even if, this data is, so to speak, de-identified. Think about the fact that now massively valuable data is sitting, global data is sitting in the hands of two private corporations that would be gold for any country or any public health authority, WHO, to figure out how this disease spreads, to inform our understanding of it scientifically. But now this data is in the hands of two corporate powers, and we have to prostrate ourselves. I'm glad to hear that only 6 states have hopped on board, and I don't know what reasons they are for doing that, but I think that's a good thing. But anyway, okay.
Yeah, thank you. I personally agree with your opinion, but
Great. Thank you so much, Sophia. So I think what we're going to do is take one more question so that we can still have time for our breakout rooms. So we're going to take this question from Ido Sivan-Sevilla. If you would like to introduce yourself and ask your question.
I think Kathy was raising her hand before me.
Oh, sorry. I totally missed it on my list. Yes. Catherine, do you want to go first?
Well, I just have 2 things that are quick, and one is that I wanted to bump up Stefan Engberg's point in the chat, which I see he also has his hand up, and ask this question about the potential for using dedicated devices as a way to deal with slippery slope problems and things like that, whether or not it uses DP3T model, actually. But the other just real quick comment I wanted to make, which follows pretty closely on what Helen said, is that I think it's important to sort of notice that this control paradigm in privacy is also a paradigm that fits extremely well with the sort of techno-libertarian view that is out there in the IT world, and is particularly with these companies, which is the idea that it's much better to go with some market corporate thing than ever to trust the government to do anything. And governments have lots of problems, but I think as a lawyer, a person who's very concerned about rule of law, I think it's dangerous. And this is sort of just, it's not just about privacy. It's a bigger picture of taking over an anti-regulatory viewpoint. So those were my comments.
Great. And yeah, I'm sorry, Catherine, for skipping you accidentally. So actually, we've decided, so we're going to continue with the questions because this is such a great discussion. We want to keep it going. We were scheduled to go for a short break now before the breakout session. So if you do need to leave to go and grab something and so on, feel free to do that. But we will be continuing with the questions just for a bit longer. So Ido Sivan-Sevilla, if you would like to ask your question now, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcini. So my name is Ido Sivan-Sevilla. I'm a postdoc at Cornell Tech with Helen's DLI group. And in the spring, I'll be joining the University of Maryland, so I can see some of my colleagues in the crowd. So basically, I'm a bit disappointed that this crisis did not create more transparency in the mobile ecosystem, right? Trust is such a big thing in this crisis. And we were revisiting these APIs and some of the core characteristics of our mobile operating systems. Maybe those of you who were involved and know what discussions were going on was more transparency on information flows in the mobile ecosystem was on the table at any point, right? We know that apps are violating privacy policies. Users have zero knowledge about this happening. And we had such an opportunity to create more visible and readable stuff for users and consumers to see how the information flows from the mobile apps and how it's being used. So I'm wondering whether it was even considered by these private companies.
Great question. So who would like to take it? Seda? Did you?
Sorry, my partner entered and said hello.
Okay, yeah, I know.
Sorry about that.
She's looking somewhere else.
We're still at home. Maybe I just want to take, I think what's really amazing about what happened with Google and Apple is they said, we don't care about the data. we want the relationship with the health authorities, and we want to be the arbiters between citizens and states. That's a position that they put. I mean, I'm not saying that that's what they officially announced, right? But like, it's very interesting how privacy by design has gone mainstream to the point where infrastructure can digest it and use it to, infrastructural companies can use it to expand their remit. And what they're going after, and this is, I was thinking about this, Helen, in your book, you think about context, health, you say education is a context, right? And we're on Zoom, right? Like, so tech companies are really benefiting from COVID-19 at this point, partially because they're collecting data, but partially because they are able to take over no longer just advertisement money, because schools don't necessarily have advertisement budgets, but they do have IT budgets, right? Universities have IT budgets, or now it's not just the IT budget, it's your teaching, it's your student relationship, it's your administrative, everything that these companies can now take. And so I think there's almost like there's the information flows which really matter, but the contact tracing app shows you that beyond that, it's about expansion of infrastructural power and a certain model of optimized management as a way to run organizations, right? That is at stake. So, so this is to say that I think if we wanted, they would give us more transparency about the information flows. That's not a problem if that's what health authorities want. What's interesting is that the health authorities are not asking for this, right? And we saw this also with contact tracing apps. We were surprised that EU or local other national governments were not making any moves to regulate these companies and saying, here's how we want you to handle things. So it's a weird moment where governments, so I'm not techno-libertarian at all, even though I know a lot of the privacy designs are coming from that tradition. What we see is a moment where governments are just as interested in population management as a mechanism as the companies that are offering these products, right? And so there is a weird collision that no techno-libertarian imagined, right? And so I think it's good to think about information flows, and I think they're really, really important, but I think it's also really important to think about infrastructural power and its proposition, and how we can have institutions that can recognize when it comes in their direction and say how they want to use it and how they do not and cannot use it if they want to have democratic societies.
I wanted to jump in and add something to what Sid is saying, because I think a lot of these public enterprises are absolutely desperate for resources. And when it's like, just a thirst, someone who's like dying of thirst in the desert, and along comes this thing, this party with a little glass of water. And one of the things that I've been hearing about these COVID times, these education pods, is that many of these education pods are taking place on Facebook. And then it turns out that, thinking more about it, a lot of municipalities don't have the money to set up their own websites. They're actually situating their governments on Facebook without, and I agree, I mean, this is what's tragic. It's like you would think, and back to Ido's question, that they would have some power to say, we need to determine what's going on underneath here, because my relationship with a citizen or resident is really different from some commercial entity with a customer. Maybe it'll happen. It has to happen.
Great. That's a great point, Helen. Thank you, Ido, for your question. So now I know it's either Stefan or Meinek next, and I'm not sure who is first. I think it's Stefan, but if Meinek, if you object, you let us know. Okay. Oh. Okay, so Stefan, do you want to ask your question and introduce yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me? Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Stefan Engberg. I have been worked as a professional in privacy by design for 20 years. I've been 10 years on the International Advisory Board on Privacy International. I was on the Strategic Advisory Board of EU Security and Dependability Task Force for some of the largest research projects there. I think that the discussion that we have now has many, many, many aspects. And that is one of the problems, is that the sheer amount of issues are overwhelming. And most people come from the situation where they think it is inevitable that we don't have control in a digital space. I would suggest an alternative way of thinking, because I actually think that we can have it. And what I wrote in the document is that the cool thing about COVID-19 is that you actually have a security problem here that is best solved perfectly anonymous. Why? Because there's zero need for accountability in the perspective that this is just about information sharing, contextual information sharing. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if you had a device that could create a connection with other devices nearby, you could resolve that in the anonymous space if you know how to do that. Right now, Google and Apple, they made this app because they wanted control of the keys. And it's simply impossible to make an anonymous solution on the mobile phone because they control the communication gateways on the phone. And Google, for instance, they will control your location in the phone. So if they know where two mobile phones are and they perhaps share a contextual key that appear to be privacy by design, they can just combine the data they have in the back channel. So they know exactly who's talking to whom. Whether they use it or not is not the question. The fact is that they do. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's a very complex question. It's not only about proximity, it's actually the smallest problem. What's much harder is that we're actually collecting DNA on a lot of citizens right now, identified. And where did security go there? We are collecting a lot of information about who communicates. When you take this app and connect to the back end, there's no security there. So point is that there's a lot of issues that we need to think into the problem. It can solve them, but most people don't know they can be solved. I don't really know. I mean, I could ramble on here, but that's not going to help. What I wanted to say is that we are starting a nonprofit in Denmark that is trying to bring out a new way of thinking identity where you use new identities every time. Point about using new identities every time is not sort of libertarian stuff where you want to be anonymous. Denmark have had national ID for 50 years, okay? We live in this Chinese nightmare where everything is collected by the government and we know what happens, okay? We're dreaming of going past that because we got all the benefits of integrated systems. We got that 30 years ago. Now we want to desegregate them again. And the way you do that is that you have a structure in the bottom. Let's call it a national ID. But you don't collect any information linked to that national ID. You use that to create new contextual ID and then use the structure to customize the contextual ID so it fits the purpose, but without citizen losing control. We've been working on this in EU for a long time, and we have technologies to do it, but most people don't even understand it's possible. I think I will rest my time here because I could ramble on for a long time. I'll just say that we can do these things.
Right. Thank you, Stefan. That was a great comment. A lot in there as well that touched on what the panelists said. So I think we'll end off here with Mainak. So Mainak, do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Moshini. So hi, I'm Mainak Mandal. It is great to be here. I'm an assistant professor in Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. And I was fortunate enough to be a postdoc with both Helen and Blaise. In fact, the postdoc that Blaise mentioned at the beginning was me. So, so it's great to be here again. So I just want to quickly comment / I have a quick comment / questions building up on Sunny's comment about this contact tracing privacy issues in India, or basically in different culture than a little bit different culture. So I was actually thinking that, so I'm currently in India, right? So I came back, and what I actually felt, it is not only about trust. So in contextual integrity, so kind of like when we are thinking about this appropriate information, appropriate flows, right? And there's this notion of societally what is correct, this ethical things, that the ethical rules that evolves over time. And one thing is possibly relevant here. So my question is, won't space also matter? By space also matter, I mean that in different countries, the appropriateness of flows would be different. For example, in India, I was one of the people who had to install Argo Setu app because I'm a federal employee and I was forced to do that per se, right? Not that I actually believed on any of the good effects of that app because I'm already in a secluded place, like in the campus, everything is locked down, right? What I'm saying is that when I talk to people, both in policy, technical and non-technical computer scientists, they actually had this idea that, we generally do this historically in our culture. The government told that get this card, get this number, and it will be used. We'll get that number. It might be tax, it might be a new identification or something like that. And I actually see this as a clash between this discussion between individualistic and collectivist societies. So the question is, even for contact tracing, which is the disruptive technology and situation all around, do we want to define the norms culturally? Or do we want a global norm which is good in the definition of some global good for different cultures?
That's a good question. And so who wants to take a stab at that? Global norms or contextual norms?
I think it's more a designer's job. Mainak, you need to do this. But by the way, it was great. Thanks, Blaise, for sending Mainak to spend a little bit of time with us. But wouldn't it be that, I think the design issue is, you put the infrastructure in, not in the sense that SADA uses it, but just like more boringly. And then you create kind of the hooks. Then you customize it. And if you don't customize, but you kind of slot everything in, then you've imposed the norms of one culture on another culture. It's probably quite difficult to do the customization, but I'm assuming it can be done.
That's great. Great answer, Helen. So I think now, in the interest of time, I want to say thank you for all your great questions, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think we've all, I certainly have learned a lot about contact tracing and so on. So thank you so much for joining the panel. I wanted to remind everyone, we're about to go into breakout sessions. There's a short break, and we'll be starting the breakout sessions at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, 11:30 CT. If you want to continue the discussion, we have those Google Docs. We put the links back in Zoom. We also have the Slack channel where you can continue the discussion and ask these questions. All the panelists and everyone is still on those channels, so we'd be happy to take more questions there. But thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see many of you in the breakout rooms. And then we'll, after the breakout sessions, Jan will help us wrap up. We'll get a report back on breakout sessions and close off the event. And
as a note on that, I'd appreciate if you, as you take like a 10-minute break, please just stay in the Zoom room, like muted, video off, because otherwise you unassign yourself from the breakout rooms and you cause me a lot of work. So yeah, we'll see you guys back in 10 minutes. We'll be starting the breakout rooms at 12:30 Eastern sharp. So see you all in 10 minutes.
Great, thank you.
And great thanks to the organizers and everybody who put this together, and to everyone who joined. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Seda. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Helen.
I think Jan is...
Jan, take it away, Jan.
Well, first of all, before we wrap up, we would like to ask the session leads, one of you should summarize the discussion, up to 3 minutes to do that, if you can, what been discussed and main points. As we were trying to reemphasize, this is really a teaser event, something that we Hopefully, we'll see you all in person in Chicago. I'll talk about it later, but really, if the section leads can summarize, and we'll start with maybe law. That's where I was in, so I'm expressing my mind, and then moving on to research in the CI, and then the last one, design. Not last but not least, design in CI.
Okay, so I will be presenting a brief summary of what we discussed in the law and CI section. We began with the question, and really this drove our whole discussion of law's role in institutionalizing boundaries of trust, right? So how is law in itself reifying who to trust, how to trust, and so on? But we quickly worked to a more CI relevant question, which is whether trying to identify which norms are legitimate. How do we decide what the norms are that we're going to use to determine appropriateness of information flows? We thought about the importance of getting to agreement, right? So not just what the norms are, but also what is the process for choosing those norms? And that's somewhere where law can be helpful, right? In providing these sorts of institutions and mechanisms, right? Law in some ways is all about the process of reaching a conclusion as much as what those conclusions are. So it offers a helpful way forward potentially for thinking about designing ways to think about norms. We also talked about the role of the shadow of the law rather than just the law. So we had some comments regarding whether attitudes, for example, towards contact tracing apps, but also other digital health initiatives in the era of the pandemic, whether the response is driven as much by what the belief about what law is rather than what the law is, right? So there's this idea of what you think your constitutional rights are versus what they actually are when you look at the case law. And these can be quite divergent. So we discussed to what role the idea of law might be driving norms or driving ideas about what is appropriate. But we also talked about more broadly, it might not just be the shadow of the law, it can also just be attitudes about the institutional actors who are involved, such as thinking about techlash. And maybe it's people's sort of affective reactions to these companies that is also driving the reactions to these apps. We then segged into thinking about sort of big tech and how these large tech companies are actually at this point serving as intermediaries between citizens and governments, and how that has been particularly salient now with COVID contact tracing apps, right? We've seen examples of countries where their efforts have really been controlled, stymied, or enabled by Google and Apple, right? And that is really interesting to think about from a normative perspective, right? That we have this entity powerful enough that it is controlling the conversation or controlling the technology. We thought about things like how demographic factors like age might be affecting norm selection or feelings about norms. And we sort of wrapped up with some discussion of international perspectives. So in particular, we looked at what India was doing, thinking about concerns they have about usage creep, about fairly invasive steps that are being taken already, where we see the use of the contact tracing app expanding or going beyond the app because so few people own smartphones. And sort of this question also with respect to law and CI of, is litigation the only mechanism that's really effective for people advocating for their rights? So it was a fairly varied conversation. I don't think I've done justice to it, but I would invite you to join our law and CI channel to continue the discussion.
This is a great summary. So can we go with the research in CI next?
Sure. I think we also had a very good conversation that sort of broke down into three components. So first, we talked a lot about our interpretations of context and how we applied that in our research. And we're realizing that depending on how many of us had originally encountered or interpreted the theory, we had different views of what context means, ranging from a very strict 5-tuple understanding of what information flow is sent and how it's treated, up to more broader interpretations of how context should be interpreted in places or in locations like the home or the medical context. And we noted how when doing CI research, and so sort of the second part of our conversation, the theory itself was often useful as a reminder at the various ways that context is nuanced. And when asking people about their interpretations of privacy or privacy violations, by hinging those questions or those research designs on the theory, we forced ourselves to stay away from interpretations of privacy that might be too broad or might assume too many things about how individuals were actually interpreting their privacy in the real world. And this brought us to what I thought was a really interesting point in that most individuals at any given time are involved in many contexts, and which one that they're viewing as being the most salient or the most important for a given information flow or a given application can not only vary over time, but also be hard for researchers to tease out when they're trying to find what matters the most for a given person. And we mentioned this as something which maybe could be worthy of more research, and also something to keep in mind when using the theory really in any context, that the way that people are interpreting their privacy isn't just sort of at one specific context at a time, but is often a blend of many. And then the last thing that we talked about was the step from taking individual interpretations of privacy violations or of privacy norms and moving those into either a societal or an application context. And we discussed how everyone has the right to have a privacy norms that they view to be appropriate for their information, but maybe when that gets translated onto the societal level, we may have societal goals or societal norms that override the priorities of individuals. And taking and doing research which takes studies of how individuals view privacy and moving that and trying to understand how that relates to broader interpretations at the societal level is something which we were still wrestling with. And that was also sort of paralleled by taking individual privacy norms and moving those into an application or a system, because we discussed how this idea that CI gives us is privacy and context can be quite nuanced and detailed and individual versus what we might want in a system application to have a strong privacy by default, or preventing people from using the system from having to go very deep into customization or personalization in order to get the privacy that they might want, was another question that is still sort of outstanding in CI and research. I also probably didn't do a good job of overviewing everything that we talked about in that discussion, but also, like Eileen, I want to encourage you to move into our Slides channel if you want to continue that conversation afterward.
That's amazing. You both did a great job. Thank you so much. Yeah, please continue the conversation on Slack. Next is Design in CI.
Hi, yeah. So we kind of continued and extended on the conversation that we were already having in the panel around surveillance technologies and design, and how those are designed in different ways depending on the information flow. And we talked about how people may feel differently about surveillance technologies depending on where that information is flowing and through what channel it's throwing through. So whether it be for the contact tracing COVID-19 context that we discussed, or if we're talking about maybe more criminal reasonings for implementing surveillance measures, and whether it's through cameras or on your phone or an actual person, there are many different ways that surveillance technology could be designed, whether it's a technology or a system, that we can consider contextual integrity and the flow of information. So we talked about understanding the benefits and the harms of information flows as those contexts shifted. And we also kind of talked about if context was removed from the situation and we didn't know where the information was flowing, how would that impact the way that their public opinion is about such technology? And then towards the end of our conversation, we started to talk about beyond the surveillance that is typically thought of as government collection, kind of transitioning into the private collection of data, whether it be private companies or individuals that have access to other individuals' data, and those information flows, and how we can design technology to protect people's privacy and empower them to make better decisions about their information flows. So that's kind of where we left it off.
This is perfect. Thank you so much, Alexis. And I was just suggesting on the chat, if you have those points written down, maybe just put them in Slack so people can comment and continue the conversation. I think this brings us to a point, of conclusion. I have to, start thanking a lot of people. But before I do, I would like to say, really amazing to see this community grow with each year, new people coming in, people coming back. This is amazing. And we have to realize that we didn't have a lot of time today, and it's just a teaser event. You can imagine like multiply 10 the feeling you will have when we meet you in person. So we really hope to see you in person in Chicago in next year and continue the conversation. So please do use all the resources we provided: Slack, emails, mailing list, Twitter. Just make sure you talk to us. We would really like to hear your feedback and how to make it better. This event is partially organized to make sure that the actual event next year will have some feedback from you on how to do it better, or some themes you would like to discuss. So please do that. Do contact us and let us know. And we'd like to stay in touch. There's so much collaboration potential here. It's amazing. Just from one session that I've been to, already thinking of 5 papers. So please do continue the conversation. All right, so lots of thanks. I would like to thank our panelists for today, Seda, Michael, and Helen, and our wonderful moderator and co-organizer, Marcini. Thank you so much. I personally feel that was amazing in terms of the depths of the discussion. And unfortunately, it was short, but we just continued with the questions to the break, and it just shows how of interest it was. So thank you so much. Our session leaders, we just heard nice summaries. We had 2 session leaders in each. So that's Alexis. I have the list. So Alexis, Kelly, Salome, Noah, and Eileen. Thank you so much for taking your time and leading the discussion. I think everyone benefited from it. So this is really great. Sorry? It was okay. Sorry. And we also had, believe it or not, they were kind of in the background, but they were taking notes. So we had really wonderful note takers. I would like to thank them for in each session. So Sophie, Valerie, and Galen, that's amazing. Thank you so much. We're trying to put something together, maybe some kind of summary of this. So again, thank you so much for this. Chicago IT staff, we had a stream of a video coming on YouTube. That's amazing. Throughout, they helped us a lot of work. So appreciate all the help and support. Yes, my wonderful co-organizers.
I was going to say specifically, thank you, Tom Dobes, and thank you, Rob Mitchum on the U Chicago side.
Yes. It's surprisingly, I think Helen mentioned, we feel like organizing a virtual event that will be just like set up a Zoom meeting, tell everyone, and everyone will show up because you don't need to feed them, you don't need to provide anything. And there's surprising a lot of work, and without that help, this event wouldn't happen. So thank you so much, sincerely. My co-organizers, Helen, Blaise, Marcini, thank you so much. Wonderful team. I think this just gives us so much motivation and momentum to go and to organize the event in person. We're looking forward to it. And this kind of, I guess that was also a point for us to have this moment to make sure that the community comes together, get the energy going, and have a more positive outlook on the future. So hopefully that will come and we'll see each other in person. And all of you joining, and I know some left, but still, this was amazing. I think I was saying this in the session we've been to, how amazing. We see this each time we organize. I think it was the first time we organized the annual CI symposium, was this feeling as how this theory brought such a diverse community together from all different disciplines. And you just hear the buzz of them talking to each other. So there's no like silos of people talking, computer scientists sitting in one corner, law people sitting in another. It's like everyone is having something to say. And it feels like, to me, I think I'm paraphrasing some, but it's like a language that people suddenly talk about the same issues. And also it brings out a lot of people just care about making systems and platforms and law and regulation that really kind of fundamentally build bringing values and normative thinking into them. So this is just wonderful to see. And I think this event just shows how we should just continue working on that. This is amazing. We have a great team. Welcome to the people who just joined, like in terms of first event. We'll look forward to see you again, and great to see people that are coming back. And with that, I think that's a wrap, unless my co-organizers would like to say a few words.
No, I just want to say thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jan, for also leading the charge, and everyone else, Helen and Blaise. It was really great. And thank you all for attending, and the session leaders as well. I think you did amazing jobs. I loved the summaries. I felt like I got out of, a little bit out of each discussion, even though I was only able to attend one. So thank you so much. And obviously to the panelists, Seda and Michael are not here, but thank you, Helen. as well. Thanks, and we hope to see you soon sometime.
Yes. Stay in touch.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.